Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. This is the word of the God.
Thanks, Leland. So if we haven't met, my name is Caroline. And we're in the middle of a series looking at the times when Jesus appeared to his disciples post-resurrection. We started with Mary Magdalene, and then last week we looked at Peter. Next week's Thomas, and today we're looking at the disciples in Luke 24. So I wonder if you had died and then been resurrected, and then walked through a wall and appeared to your closest friends, what would be the first words you said to them? I think if it was me, I might be tempted to say, "Ta-da! I'm back." Maybe you would choose something a little bit more conservative, like "How's it?" or "Good afternoon." But I love the words that Jesus chose after he had been resurrected. And Jesus, being Jesus, would have had since before the foundation of the world to think about what words he was going to say. So if you're a creationist, that means he had more than 6,000 to 7,000 years to think carefully about these words and choose them. If you're not a creationist, well, he had even longer. But I love that Jesus enters with these carefully chosen words, "Peace be with you." So one commentator I read said this was simply a Jewish greeting like shalom, which is a very beautiful greeting, and it means peace be with you in every context. It's a very holistic greeting of peace, mind, body, spirit, emotions. And that's beautiful in itself, right? But I want to point us today to the amplified version of the Bible and what it says for verse 36, where Jesus uses the words, "Peace be with you." We've got a slide for that. Yeah, thanks, Martha. So this is the amplified version, and the amplified version of the Bible is like, it's a great version. It's a bit of a study guide because it will give us additional phases of meaning from the original language that some other versions don't always give. So, verse 36 in the Amplified Bible, look at this phrase, "Peace be with you." Jesus himself took his stand among them, and he said to them, "Peace," meaning freedom from all the distresses that are experienced as the result of sin, "be to you." Isn't that an amazing definition of peace? And aren't you grateful that the Anglicans who wrote the Book of Common Prayer didn't go for that 17-word definition? So when we share the peace in the service, we don't have to say all 17 words. We can just say, "Peace be with you." But from this morning's point of view, we're going to look at those 17 words because I think it's amazing that when Jesus appears to his disciples, the very first thing he says to them is, freedom from all the distresses that are experienced as the result of sin. It could be your sin, it could be others' sin, it could be sin caused by this broken world that we live in. But he offers us freedom to all captives, pardon for all prisoners. This is what he chooses to say to his friends post-resurrection. Now, we can only guess what sort of distresses caused by sin the disciples were experiencing at that moment in time. But I think it's probably safe to say they were feeling deeply sad and bewildered at what had just happened. And they could have avoided that deep sadness and bewilderment if they'd chosen to believe Jesus, who had told them, I will die and rise again. But they hadn't believed him, and so now they were experiencing this distress. We know from John 20, which is the same story told in John's Gospel, that they were feeling scared. John 20 said they were fearful of the Jewish authorities, and they were huddled together in this room because they were scared. So that's another distress they were feeling as a result of their failure to listen to God. Because just 6 chapters earlier in John 14, he told them, don't be afraid. But there they were, scared. And then if you were Peter, well, I think you would have been feeling a whole host of emotions. Probably shame, guilt, embarrassment, maybe anger at yourself because of your denial. But what does Jesus do with all of these distresses caused by sin? He says, freedom. Here's my freedom from all those things. And in those 4 little words, he is offering them forgiveness for those who doubted or denied him. He's offering them a new start for those of them who probably felt like their whole relationship with Jesus had just fallen over. And he's offering them a lifting of the anxiety which must surely have been crippling them since he died. Jesus himself says the phrase, peace be with you, 2 other times in the Bible, apart from this. And in the King James Version of the Bible, the word peace appears 429 times. The phrase, don't be afraid, which is another way of saying peace be with you, appears 365 times. And Jesus himself says it 10 times. So I think it's safe to say that peace is a big deal to God. Peace doesn't just appear on the outskirts of the subplots of the Bible. It is the plot. It's the main thing. It's the gospel. And so that was the disciples and the distresses that they might have been feeling. But what sort of distresses might you or I be feeling this week as a result of sin? Could be your own sin. This week I found myself worrying about the exact things that Jesus tells me not to worry about in Matthew 6. So I'm looking to him for some freedom from that distress, from my failure to trust him. It could be someone else's sin that's causing you distress. We don't have to look far in our broken world for examples of that. But the classic example is the distress that comes if you're in an abusive relationship. One party who has the power, they were either given it or they took it, and they abuse and they misuse that power, and they can cause untold distress and damage to the other person. So that's an example of distress caused by someone else's sin. But whether it's your own sin or someone else's or the world's sin, none of these things stand a chance when Jesus looks us in the eye with his blend of power and love. And he says, peace be with you. He says, freedom from all of the distresses and anxieties that are caused by sin. You see, peace on its own is wonderful, and it brings a deep calm. But this kind of peace, the peace that's coupled with freedom, a freeing peace or a peaceful freedom, that's real shalom. And I think that is what Jesus meant when he said those words to his disciples. So our God says, peace be with you. And then the second thing I notice in this passage is that our God seeks us out first. Our God seeks us out first. Do you notice how Jesus came to the disciples? He found them. It wasn't the other way around. He didn't wait for them to go looking for him. Probably because he knew they didn't have it in them to do anything other than huddle scared in a room. I think their faith was at an all-time low. But it's not just in this passage that we see Jesus making the first move, or Jesus seeking us out first. It's a pattern that we see all over the Bible. We love because Jesus first loved us. 1 John 4:19. And the Bible is a whole love story, really, of God wooing us, of him making himself vulnerable, of him being prepared to express first his desire to be in relationship with us. We see it as early as Genesis. Do you remember Genesis 3? Straight after sin has entered the world and Adam and Eve have messed up royally. And the onus is definitely on them relationally to make the first move, if you will. But our God is never passive. He never takes the moral high ground. He always shows grace. He shows himself to be the initiator, relationally speaking. And even while God is busy telling the serpent what the result of the curse is going to be on him, he says in front of Adam and Eve, Eve, your offspring will crush the head of Satan, which is already referring to God's rescue plan. God, the initiator, is already on the case. He's not leaving Adam and Eve dead in their sins. Ephesians 2:15 says, while we were still dead in our sins, God made a plan. And we're seeing it here as early as Jesus. He seeks us out first. I heard a beautiful story recently about a 9-year-old boy. He's the son of some friends of mine. And this 9-year-old boy had been bullied horribly at school. And it was obviously very upsetting. But a little while after the incident, when things had settled, this boy who had been bullied decided that he was going to befriend the boy who had bullied him. And he had the grace and the maturity that few 9-year-old boys would have to reach out the hand of friendship. And they got talking, and one thing led to another. And it culminated in this boy who'd been bullied lending the boy who'd bullied him his most precious possession, which happened to be his Bible. I mean, that was the cherry on top for me, that it was his Bible. It could have been anything. It didn't matter really what his most precious possession was, but the fact that it was his Bible made it even more beautiful. I mean, what grace. But more than that, isn't it a brilliant picture of how God treats us? God, who has every right to take the moral high ground with us, never does so. But he reaches out the hands of friendship and he says, let's be friends. And then if that's not enough, he gives us his most precious possession, which is his son, who then dies for us. So I thought that was a really beautiful story. The resurrected Jesus, similarly, was not in the wrong. Yet he sought out his disciples. He came to them and he offered them peace and reconciliation. Now, was that fair on Jesus? No. Was it his turn to be the next one to say something in the relationship? Not at all. But God is not interested in fairness with his children. Mercifully, he's interested in grace. And grace trumps fairness every single time. Grace trumps fairness every single time. And so I wonder if there's any of us here today, me or you, who might need to seek someone out, who might need to make the first move with someone else relationally. Maybe someone's done you wrong and you're sitting there waiting for them to apologize or make the first gesture. But Paul says we must be imitators of Christ. So maybe God is nudging us this morning. If there's someone in your life who you need to contact and make the first move relationally. That's the nature of our God. So we have God saying, peace and freedom be with you. We have God seeking us out first. And then the last thing I notice in this passage is that our God has wounds and scars. Our God has wounds and scars. And we've got a slide for this, Martha. Thank you. Verse 38. Jesus says, why are you frightened? Why are your hearts filled with doubt? Look at my hands. Look at my feet. You can see that it's really me. Touch me and make sure. As he spoke, he showed them his hands and his feet. And then John 20, it's the same story. It's a little bit more visceral, this version. As he spoke, Jesus showed them the wounds in his hands and his side. Imagine being with the resurrected Jesus and he actually shows you the wounds in his hands and his side. So maybe you've already considered this, but I have to say this was new for me as I was preparing for today. Verse 38 kind of struck me in a new way. And what grabbed me was the fact that Jesus, the author of life itself, the healer with a capital H, the all-powerful, stronger than death Jesus, who did miracles, who healed people, just a touch of his robe was enough to send disease running. This Jesus has wounds and scars on him. How can that be? My little mind was just assuming that he would be perfect, spotless, risen from the dead. He's life himself. He's healing himself. But now this Jesus, the King of Glory, has scars and wounds. Shouldn't he be defect-free? Shouldn't he be blemish-free, as the cosmetics industry likes to call it? Shouldn't he be flawless, aesthetically speaking? And I get that the scars needed to be there on one level because they needed to convince the disciples that it was the same Jesus. It wasn't an imposter, it wasn't a ghost. This was really Jesus who they'd spent the last 3 years with. So I get that from that point of view, really important. But if we just put that aside for a moment, why would perfect Jesus still have disfigurements on him? And I realized that it was this actually messed a bit with my idea of a resurrected body, because I'm going to have a resurrected body one day, so will you. And I had been looking forward to my resurrected body being, let's say, aesthetically perfect. And now I'm thinking, if Jesus' post-resurrection body was not as defect-free as I thought it should be, what am I going to look like? So I was fine with the part where you get to walk through walls. Having that property as a resurrected body, that ticks the box for me. I think that's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to the practical jokes I'm going to play on you all in heaven as I walk through walls and surprise you when you don't expect me to be there. But this thing about scars and wounds, I didn't expect that. And we know, of course, that it wasn't like God ran out of power. It wasn't like there was a heavenly glitch on the day and he just, healed the rest of the body, but oops, not enough power for the wounds and the scars. It must be surely that Jesus chose to have these scars and wounds on his body. And then that became an even more fascinating thought for me. I thought it's one thing that he has them in the first place. It's another thing that the King of Glory must have chosen to have them. And the more I thought about this, I thought, could it be that on Jesus, even scars are beautiful? And then as I read more and thought more, I had some sort of musings and imaginings in my mind's eye. And I imagined Team Trinity having a conversation in the week leading up to Easter about what Jesus' resurrection body was going to look like. Now hold this lightly. This is not in the Bible. I don't want to be accused of heresy here. This is just me imagining, right? And as I thought about it more, in my mind's eye, I saw Team Trinity having a little chat in the week leading up to Easter about what Jesus' body was going to look like. And I imagined them debating and discussing and saying, yes, okay, Jesus is going to have flesh and bones and muscles. He's going to have all 5 senses so he can enjoy a meal with his friends. He's going to have the supernatural property of being able to walk through walls. And then I imagined them saying, okay, and what about the aesthetics? And with their blend of humor and holiness that I imagine them to have in their interactions with one another, I imagined them sort of saying, well, will his post-resurrection body, what are we going to do? Halo, no halo, sandals, no sandals, white robe with gold trim, dazzling gold robe with white trim, and just having a bit of fun with it. And then I imagined God the Father turning to Jesus and saying, and of course, my son, your wounds will be gone. And I imagine Jesus saying very respectfully, but very adamantly, actually, God, Holy Spirit, I think I'm going to keep my wounds. And the other two look a little bit surprised in my mind's eye, and they let him go on. And he says, you see, I just love all our children so much. It was the wounds that showed them that. It was the wounds that drew them to me. It was the wounds that shouted from the mountaintops that I loved them enough to die for them, and that I could not face eternity without them. My wounds are my resurrected body's signature look for a desperately good and beautiful reason. And I want to wear my scars proudly and valiantly and victoriously for my children to see, and so that they may never forget that they, my children, were the joy set before me when I went to the cross. Now you must hold that very lightly, as I said. But what you can hold to very firmly is Romans 8:34. Who then will condemn us? No one, for Christ died for us and was raised to life for us, and he is sitting at the place of honor at God's right hand, pleading for us. One writer who I read said that this verse, Romans 8:34, is a poignant and evocative picture of the Son Jesus showing his wounds to his Father and saying, "Look, Dad, see how I've loved them. Their debt is paid. Have mercy on them. Remember our victory on the cross, where death was defeated by life. Our greatest triumph. Nothing and no one can condemn them. They are mine, Dad. I bought them at a price. Their debt is paid." How gracious that God sits at the right hand pleading for us. St. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century priest, he was one of the people who I found who also wondered why Jesus in all his power and majesty could have scars disfiguring his body. And he said this of Jesus. There is a slide for this. Thanks, Martha. St. Thomas Aquinas said that Jesus kept his scars not from an inability to heal them, but to wear them as an everlasting trophy of his victory. His wounds, then, are not a deformity, but there is a dignity in them, and a certain kind of beauty shines in them. So St. Thomas says Jesus would keep his scars because they're an everlasting trophy of God's victory. They're an everlasting trophy of God's victory. Now, what does that mean? Well, Tim Keller says something that I think helps answer that. He says that Jesus' wounds in his resurrected body are there to show the disciples that the very thing they thought had ruined their lives had actually saved them. The very thing they thought had ruined their lives had actually saved them. See, remember the disciples had been there. They had physically, with their own eyes, watched the nails being hammered into Jesus' hands and feet. With their own eyes, they'd seen the sword being the spear going into his side. It must have been absolutely desperate. They must have felt crushed. They must have felt that, like when Jesus breathed his last breath, that they were pretty much breathing theirs, that their lives must surely be over. And they must have felt like the last 3 years had been some form of cruel joke. They must have felt like it was all over. But in fact, Jesus dying on the cross, taking their sin for them, is not what ruined the disciples' lives. It's what saved them. Jesus' death doesn't dash the disciples' hopes. It is their hope. That is the gospel. And so what looked like defeat on the cross was actually God's means for his greatest triumph. And that is why Jesus' scars are an everlasting trophy of that victory. So perhaps there's something in my life or your life right now that seems like it's ruining things, but in fact, God is allowing it to save you. Our God is always at work behind the scenes. Philippians 1 verse 6. We know that he's faithful to complete the good work that he started in us. And that work's often imperceptible to our eyes, but he's there, soldiering on. He brings order out of chaos. He brings life out of death. He brings blessing out of curses. And he works all things together for good in his children's lives. And so Jesus' scars are an everlasting trophy of God's faithful habit of bringing victory out of situations where defeat seemed inevitable. And then lastly, why else are the scars important? Well, I think Jesus' wounds, they speak volumes in an apologetics context. What I mean by that is that if we're tempted to think of God as just a kind of moral concept or as goodness per se, a good man and a solid teacher but not the Son of God, or a mere religious symbol, then his scars make us think again. Because his scars call on us to stop talking and to stop thinking about God or Jesus in a very general way, and to start looking at him very personally and very directly. Why would someone die if their destiny was to be a mere symbol of religion? They wouldn't. There's not enough at stake. But if you are dying for the joy set before you, that's me and you, then that makes you God. A mere prophet would not go to the cross to die for people, but a man who dies for the whole of humanity to prove his love, that's not a mere symbol of religion. That's our God. You see, dying for others shows you're the most loving force in the universe. And raising someone from the dead shows you're the most powerful force in the universe. And if you're both those things, well, that's our God. A God who's just loving but not powerful enough, no thanks. And a God who is powerful but not loving, no thanks. But a God who is both, well, that God defends my faith and he melts my skeptical heart. So in closing, scars are very powerful things, so are wounds. Let's not underestimate them. Let's not shun them in ourselves. Let's not shun them in other people. They have the power to convert, to persuade, to fight doubt, to reignite hope. Look at Thomas. It was Jesus' wounds that did all those things for him. Sorry, that's probably a bit of a spoiler for next week. But with God's touch, scars can be beautiful. And God in his grace can use even my scars and even your scars to encourage others if we let him. Think about it. Are you more encouraged hearing the story of somebody who was mostly getting things right but kept going, or of hearing a story of somebody who was having a tough time involving many wounds and scars but persevered? 2 Corinthians 1 verse 4 talks about God comforting us in our troubles so that we can comfort others in their times of need. And part of being in community is being willing to share with one another what our scars and wounds are. Isaiah 61 verse 3, and we'll close with this. It says that God will give us a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, and festive praise instead of despair. And so if we ask, God will take our wounds and he will cause a kind of beauty to shine through them. And in so doing, he's going to give others hope. Amen.